Brace yourself.
So there are a lot of games that I've been meaning to get around to, but I think when it comes to being shamefully late to the party, Braid is definitely up there. In spite of everything that's transpired since the game's launch, from the prominence of self-publishing developers to indie games carrying a level of stigma from more traditional gaming demographics, in spite of all of that, I've never actually played Braid. In fact, I've barely even seen gameplay footage of it. Like many games that I tell myself I'm definitely gonna play someday, I wanted to keep Braid's true essence preserved until I actually gave it some time, which was something that I never formally delegated. Until now. Despite having Braid in my Steam library for years, it wasn't until this year that I actually set time aside to see what the hype was about. As you can expect from a game from so long ago, my first experience with Braid didn't come without expectations. This is a game that's earned so much critical acclaim and such a strong presence in the indie sphere that I still feel embarrassed in saying that I'm just now giving it a shot. But now, a decade has passed since this humble indie project turned game culture benchmark set Xbox Live on fire, and I think now's as good a time as any to dig in deep and see what Braid does or doesn't do to earn such popularity. It's been a while, and the critical sphere has lightened the load that post-launch hype tends to bring. I think it's time to really give this game an honest look. Today, we're looking at Braid 10 years later. Braid's gameplay at first glance is pretty standard for what you'd expect in a puzzle platformer. Running and jumping to reach the end of a level while collecting some items along the way, simple stuff. But this is all until Braid's core mechanic steps into the scene: time manipulation. The protagonist Tim can use a variety of methods to change time's flow. Rewinding time replaces a traditional fail state, replaying time lets Tim perform a previous action again via a shadow doppelganger, the ring lets him slow time in a specific area of a stage. These are pretty simple ideas. While controlling time is by no means an original element for video games, Braid approaches this tried and true concept with an impressive level of nuance. It's a game that really shows creativity in how these abilities are used. Braid forces the player to think ahead, think behind, and think in pretty much every direction possible. The puzzle design in Braid nearly always capitalizes on forcing the player to think beyond the straight line. Being able to rewind time to an earlier event, replay events so that they occur in tandem with what's happening in the present, or slowing time and individual hazards to a crawl are demonstrated on a level-wide scale. This means that the player needs to fully comprehend how what they do can affect a level's components, and it admittedly threw me for quite a loop right out of the gate. But I think that Braid's creator, Jonathan Blow, introduces each stage's time-related gimmick pretty organically. Braid is a demanding experience when it comes to puzzle complexity. It wastes no time in making the player feel pressured by the rules of the world they explore. But at the same time, Braid feels just as humble as its protagonist. There are rules to each time manipulation skill, but it's the way the world contorts these rules that makes Braid's best moments shine. Earning the puzzle pieces in each world is what Braid really wants the player to do. While you can easily reach the door to the next level in each stage, the puzzle pieces are usually placed in out-of-reach locations that practically require thinking beyond the straight line and using time manipulation powers in unorthodox ways. Blow's creative design on each puzzle is really a testament to his artistic ingenuity. A lot of these puzzles are real brain teasers, but at the same time work wonders in utilizing a pretty small toolbox of techniques. Braid tends to theme each world around a specific time manipulation technique, while still keeping them from overlapping too much. I think this was a smart move, and while combining various time-related gimmicks could have made for labyrinthine levels of puzzle depth, it was accommodating of Blow to keep each major technique separate from each other. It keeps puzzles from getting out of control in their intricacy, while simultaneously theming each world with specific gimmicks in the different stages. This demanded creative restraint, but I do think that this was the better direction for Blow to take. But I don't think Braid is perfect. In fact, its flaws are pretty apparent. Despite its gameplay strengths, it lacks something a truly great puzzle game needs to have: precision. One of the most noticeable flaws of puzzle platformers is, in my eyes anyway, a lack of honed design. Solving a puzzle in Braid or any other puzzle platformer demands both problem solving and platformer finesse. You can't have one without the other, at least in the best examples of the genre. Braid suffers a bit because of this. The puzzles are fascinating, but with physics and collision detection being a constant limiter for platformers, I solved these puzzles without feeling like I did them right. There were many moments that lacked that feeling of precision, that decidedly structured conquest. There were times where I solved a puzzle, but I didn't feel like I solved it in the way that the developers intended. This was especially the case in the late game, where moves like slowing time and replaying time were added into the fold, so I found myself mindlessly looking for a solution and simply stumbling into one. Is this necessarily my fault? Possibly, but there were moments where I felt like I didn't follow the developers' intentions, and I can't remember a game that made this feeling as tangible and realized as I felt with Braid. Of course, I can't really discuss Braid in depth without addressing its narrative. It's a story of Tim, a humble man trying to save a princess from a monster. It's a routine setup, one of the most common in folklore, fable, and modern epic alike, but Braid attempts to take its story a bit further by peppering the gameplay with written interludes between each world. These books tend to tell the story in a verbose and poetic way, but I honestly found the tone to walk a bit too close to pretentiousness. In the rare moments of pitch-perfect clarity in its narrative delivery, there is some heart-wrenching emotion. But it isn't really until the final act that the gameplay takes control of delivering the narrative. I've said routinely that a game can be art if it merges the emotional wavelength of its avatar to the player, and if Braid does do that, it's when the final act appears. I do not want to spoil the ending of the game without proper warning, but I do think that how Braid approaches its narrative in this ending is very important to analyzing the story. And fortunately, I can provide a timestamp for those who, like me, were late to the party for this 10-year-old game. If you want to skip to the next section, click the timestamp shown. If not, here we go. The last act begins with the aforementioned princess running away from a knight. As the player continues through the labyrinth below to follow her, with the princess triggering switches to assist in Tim's traversal, the player eventually reaches the princess's home. The player is then forced to reverse this scenario, revealing that the princess was actually trying to escape from Tim, with the knight taking her away to safety. The twist that Tim is actually the monster the game referred to is already a pretty great twist, but having the player replay the scene in reverse themselves instead of simply via text or a cutscene displays an interesting approach to player agency and expectations. Yes, the amount of input is practically the bare minimum, but that moment of steady emotional realization as you play through a game sequence is what has defined some of my favorite artistic artifacts in the video game medium. Braid, because of its simplicity, doesn't entirely make that pantheonic step, but I think it's actually a very well implemented twist that reframes the game in a surreal way. Still, the chapter following the princess's escape is about as artistically pretentious as the earlier portions, but the final scene of Tim building a castle out of the icons representing each stage in his journey is a fine bit of symbolism. His destination was never fully attained, but he still has an entire journey to reflect on. It's a fitting lesson, one that feels as looming and unsettling as the realization of Tim's true identity as the villain. I think Braid's aesthetic direction is oddly what sealed its fate in gaming history, and why indie games seem to have both an aura and stigma to them. The graphics emulate the style of a children's book, with thick, intricately stroked models and a color palette rich with varying hues. Despite the level hazards demonstrating danger and peril, everything in Braid feels so inviting, almost existing as a kind of playfulness with the whimsical, surreal nature of 2D platformers before it. In fact, some levels even explicitly reference these games. While some models tend to look a bit washed out, they have a personality, like the rabbits who screech and leap at Tim when he approaches. Braid immediately gives off a vibe of pleasant surreality, a calling card to media like Alice in Wonderland, where the world's bizarre nature contrasts the ordinary vibe of its protagonist. It's interesting despite its overtly bookish style, and it made me just as curious as Alice, struggling to find that comfort of basic sense. And I really need to hand it to Blow's decision on the musical score, which is so simple and stripped down, but so very memorable. The selection of Magnatune label artists is cream of the crop. The soundtrack tenuously walks the line of moody ambiance and pleasantly emotive acoustic instrumentation. The strings theme of the opening world is simply beautiful, but the music slowly evolves into a darker mood as the player gets further and further in the game. Even in the opening stage, there's a feeling not just of pleasantry, but of isolation. There's a looming somberness to Braid's musical score, even in its most upbeat of moments, constantly reaffirming that Tim is alone in this journey. The juxtaposition of curious whimsy with unsettling loneliness is bizarre. I definitely found myself pondering this creative musical direction throughout my entire playthrough. I steadily was letting it color my interpretation of Blow's story, and I firmly believe that Braid would be a lesser game without it. By the end of Braid's Tale, I was still trying to collect my full thoughts on it. While its final act wasn't a bombshell shocker, it did resonate, begging for introspection in the same way a great twist should. And Braid does deserve this. It feels avant-garde, but at the same time very grounded and humble. This crazy cocktail that some of the most notable indie projects in the last decade continue to drink. Braid's story is rich with meaning, despite the pretentious way the game tells it. Its puzzles are fascinating despite the obtuse way the game delivers them. The platforming is fun despite the sloppy way the game presents it. In spite of all of this, yeah, that's the best way to describe it. It's a game that I can't help but say, in spite of. Braid was one of the major turning points for independent game development. While games like Braid are a dime a dozen nowadays, this was a daring project in 2008. Before indie games could really be seen as integral to the gaming culture and industry. And I think that in spite of frames the cultural mindset of 2008 in gaming well. Braid's moments of imprecision don't hinder what is otherwise an influential and captivating project, one that delivered a message to the industry that these kinds of experiences are not just allowed, but welcome. I have issues with Braid, but in spite of all of its flaws, it was a journey worth taking. And saying this a long 10 years after the game's release, I think that means that there's something truly magical about Braid.